It is the sixth model of the Rockman.EXE collab introduced in the 2022 rerun. It is RME05 Uranade, with a kit of Scrape, Wide Break, Tornado, Float Legs, and the leg ability of Lars, which is a new leg ability that buffs power of gravity attribute skills by 20% of their melee and shoot resist combined for bonus damage. Now, as the sixth model of the collaboration, it is yet another returnee from the Rockman series. Rather interesting choice in my personal opinion, given that Sword Blues and Leader Colonel were kind of meant to highlight the Battle Network 5 segment and game in particular, which Serenade, which is the motif of this model, never quite showed up in. But all the same, still packing some very dangerous skills that, if used correctly, can make Uranade an absolute menace on the field. Scrape is a support-based skill and a new skill at that, but explained simply, it applies Effect Clear as a passive bonus skill, or bonus additional skill, I guess you can call it, for one turn to an ally's attack or their next attack. And to explain Effect Clear briefly, simply put, is that if it damages a target, it will pile punish damage relative to the number of buffs they have, as well as, and then also forcibly remove them upon completion of the attack. So having this just as a passive will make this very, very dangerous. And I've been seeing a noticeable trend as well between now Scrape as well as Buff Trap, as a way to counteract people that have been using, say, Stat Cleanse as a way to keep negative ailments at bay, which, much like Leader Colonel, Uranade also does tend to have a specialty in that can make it very dangerous. Wide Break is a gravity attribute skill which will tie into its leg ability very nicely, but simply put, it is an AoE skill, instead of a standard pierce damage skill that either press or break typically are. But because it is a gravity attribute skill, it does get a success bonus relative to a certain amount of charge in your gauge, as well as having an additional passive on heavy punish. So if anyone is using 2 or more heavy parts, you are absolutely going to be laying on the hurt, but if anyone's using one or none, not as much. Tornado is a relatively rare skill we've only seen a handful of times, and has been only available to just a very small handful of bots. But to explain briefly, it is considered a paralyzed ailment, much like Shock or Freeze, but it has an additional caveat that once you catch a foe in a tornado, it also makes them susceptible to anti-air weakness, which adds an additional utility to that particularly niche skill. That way, when used correctly, it can be used in a very terrible 1-2 combo for very quick destruction and crippling of any potentially strong enemies you want to get rid of quickly. Now, it is also worth mentioning with Tornado, however, that it is considered the paralyzed ailment with the lowest duration. So naturally, you want to make sure that you pay close attention to the timing between you using Tornado and your next punish skill behind it, if you want to make sure they don't perhaps escape it too early before you have the chance to attack on it. Now, across the board, Uranade is actually pretty solid too. I mean, arms are just a hair squishy, but still in that nice little sweet spot of where you want to be. Head is about 3550 HP, arms at about 3000 each, legs at about 3400 is a very nice HP pool. Doesn't mean that Uranade is going to be pretty tanky across the board and not going to be very easily crippled, as one may think. Base power is actually pretty good too, at 1266, and granted, even as an AoE skill, 1266 is honestly a very nice sweet spot for a skill like Wide Break, but that's also not tying in the bonus that it would get relative to the shoot and melee resist of the Lars leg ability, but I will touch on that in just a moment. And then Tornado, even if it doesn't have pierce damage or a very high base damage at 755, that honestly is fine, because as an ailment, you don't really need to worry about damage with it. Float Legs also guarantee that Uranade will have relatively solid coverage across most terrains very, very nicely. And that A rank on all terrains means that it's going to be packing about an additional 10% of what you see here to the stats before it even touches the field, before any additional meta rodder bonuses or buff bonuses. But even the base skill, the stats are pretty nice too. At about 768, mobility is nice in that general sweet spot for where Float Legs want to be, kind of that upper tier essentially. Evade of 830 isn't too bad. Could be better, but honestly, not too shabby either. Melee resist to 940 is not too shabby. It's not too shabby. In addition, maybe take just a little bit more punish damage from melee, but not enough to overly cripple it. And then a shoot resist of 1208 is very, very nice though. Means that it can absolutely take a hit from afar without it breaking anything or crippling it too easily. As a pure set score, I do honestly have to rate Uranade a pretty solid 7.5 out of 10. Scrape works pretty well with pretty much any ailment across the board, since it is basically effect clear as an additional action, I guess you can call it. And when you pair that with, say, Tornado, that can make and basically guarantee that any ailment that lands with that particular skill is going to be caught up in the wind, which will make very useful for anyone that is packing anti-air on the team that Uranade is sided on. Across the board, like I mentioned, it is relatively solid stats. There really is no particular weakness that I do see to Uranade. Pretty well rounded for what it offers. A lot of skills do synergize with each other very nicely, and wide break for heavy punish is generally something you can't really ever go wrong with either. As a mixed parts score, I would honestly have to rate Uranade very equally at a 7.5 out of 10, given that you can essentially use any of the parts anywhere. Effect clear, especially as an additional action through Scrape, can be used anywhere with no major drawback or fallback, especially since it has 5 head uses at base. So that means you can capitalize on this very, very nicely, especially if you want to, say, double team a particular enemy after any buffs have been removed to guarantee they can't move them, such as, say, a healer or a support buffer. In addition, wide break, tornado, and float legs you generally can't go wrong with anywhere, even if the legs do have a particular favor towards gravity attribute skills. That really isn't something to worry about too much, as you can usually meet that pretty easily. And in particular, when you're using gravity skills, you're already going to have a plan in mind of how to use them. Now, as a final note on Uranade as well, kind of touching on the popular debate between the Rockman community over Serenade's gender initially. Uranade in this case is gender N, which is canonical to Serenade as well from the Battle Network series, which means in this case for Metarot, you can use any of Uranade's parts on any model. This includes male or female tin pets, adding for even better utility and flexibility when it comes to your team builds.